BBC Upload. The best in new comedy, poetry and spoken word.
And this is rather cool, actually. A bit more than cool. I think it's very, very cool. From nymphs to protecting wildlife to gods hiding in the fog, we're going to be meeting the Shrewsbury writer who's taken the place that he grew up in to a whole new magical level. Now, Oliver Ferguson grew up in the Black Mountain Valley, so it's just a little drive away from Oswestry. And from investigating his hometown's folklore, he's created this piece that puts kind of fantasy writing at the very top of our agenda. And it's kind of based on his childhood too. Now, he said he started writing about the same time he could walk, flogging stapled together short stories to his grandparents. So been up for it for quite some time. But now let's go fast forward to today. And he's a full-time fiction writer with a flourishing YouTube channel and a science-based fantasy novel on the way. Very talented guy. He's been telling me about this piece that he sent in to us about the folklore of the Welsh marches like you've never heard it before. So get ready for this.
My name's Oliver Ferguson. I've sent you a piece that I wrote a little while ago called Moon over Black Mountain Valley. Basically a piece about where I grew up when I used to live in Wales when I was a kid in a village called Llangynog. Well, I call it a magical realist kind of take on my childhood, basically.
When I think of the moon as it was back then, I only ever remember it being full over the valley. It would rise from behind Croagruath, the Black Mountain, beaming like a new sun. As it arched over the crooked valley and the village at its end, the silver light would stroke every corner of it.
Lovely piece. It's really magical and really descriptive. So if I was going to ask you to describe it to me, what was in your head when you were writing it?
I wanted to write something about obviously where I grew up, but where I grew up happens to be kind of steeped in mythology and history and legend and folklore and everything, as much of Wales is and much of sort of the Midlands is as well, really, with the amount of history that's happened here. I sort of wanted to include that in it somehow because it was always in the background, and I don't think I really realised that when I was a child, and so I'm sort of looking back on it with that knowledge now. I also wanted to talk about how we sort of look at our own, each of our own personal histories, especially our childhood. We look at that with sort of rose-tinted glasses, and we kind of create our own personal mythologies about our own pasts. So I thought it would be a really interesting way of looking at that for myself, but using the actual folklore around me as well that was always around me. So I think that was kind of what was sort of going on in the background, boiling away in my brain when I was writing it.
Especially those things that had no one around to remember them. The spirits of all that has happened and was never seen. These are what are pulled from the craggy rocks of the valley by the moonlight, like secret plants, while everything living sleeps. Confluence is a word that's important to this particular valley.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lovely way to do it. I mean, I grew up reading Enid Blyton books and things like that, Magic Faraway Tree and, you know, all that kind of thing.
Tree, yeah.
Yeah, totally brilliant story. And I know what you mean when you say you look back on your childhood with those sort of, you know, that sort of view, you know, because you did have magical places that you had in your childhood, didn't you? You know, and it's really interesting that where you're from, a lot of the places were and are magical. You know, there's a lot of folklore there. Do you really like folklore and that kind of thing? Is that something that you look into quite a lot?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm slightly obsessed with mythology, and you know, obviously, in school we were quite lucky. We were one of the only sort of state schools that were taught classical civilizations, and this was in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr. We were taught all sort of, you know, the Odyssey and Troy and all of those stories. We read them and were taught about them and analysed them and everything, and I've just been obsessed with it since then. But I also realised I didn't know enough about Welsh mythology, especially because I lived there. I felt like I should know more about it, you know, and especially because in particular Welsh mythology is so interesting because it wasn't really affected so much by the sort of Norman conquest, so it sort of goes back sort of even further than a lot of the sort of normal mythology to do with England that we might think about, like King Arthur and things like that, you know. Basically, yes, I'm obsessed with history and mythology and how that all kind of works together.
A large peacock blocked my way. It looked at me and fanned out its tail. I went inside to tell my parents, but it was gone by the time I came back out. I seem to remember hearing it caw behind our house, somewhere up the Black Mountain. There had always been stories of a monster on the mountain. Perhaps time had become mixed up, and the valley in the past was remembering the valley in the future.
Why did you write it? I mean, are you a writer or are you doing something completely different? I mean, how did it actually come about where you kind of wrote this story?
I am a writer, yeah. Since writing that, I've actually gone self-employed as a writer, and I'm currently writing a book as well, which actually uses sort of influences from Welsh mythology in it as well, but more in a science fiction kind of setting. I'd studied film at university. I did film production, and in the process of that, I made a documentary about this town in Portugal, which had been decimated by the financial crash. We used a lot of Portuguese mythology to sort of look at parallels in the past and just tell the story of the people that live there now. Because quite often the way to bring out the truth I find about a place and the real people living there is to look at the stories they tell each other. That was something I really learnt when I was doing film, and since then I've gone into writing. I've always written. I've sort of gone back to my original love when I was a child of writing books and writing stories, and tried to take that with me as well, that sort of lesson.
He's just brilliant, isn't he? Also, when I was speaking to him, I was saying that I think you've got a great career ahead as a voice actor too, because not only did he write that story, but the way he kind of presented to us here at Upload, he recorded it for us and sent us in, and he's got a great sort of storytelling voice as well. We are going to find out more about him a little bit later on, talking about how a career in a museum and Lego shops has kind of turned into this life of being a full-time writer. If you want to find him, which I suggest you do, find him on YouTube and on his website, and he is Oliver Ferguson, and you'll find him just there. Sound of Billie Eilish with Birds of a Feather. Now, if I was to say to you kind of fantasy novels, if I was going to say something like magic to you, fairies in the bottom of your garden, the magic faraway tree. What's the other one that she did? Oh, was it the magic... It's a magic wishing chair or something like that. All those kind of magical things when you were little, wandering around the garden, you know, and expecting all these like wizards to appear from everywhere. This is kind of where we're going with this next guest. Now, Oliver Ferguson grew up in the Black Mountain Valley, so just a little drive away from Oswald Street. And from investigating his hometown's folklore, he's created this piece that puts fantasy writing at the top of our agenda. Now, he started writing about the same time he could walk, and now today he's continued writing the whole of his life. He's a full-time fiction writer with a flourishing YouTube channel and a science-based fantasy novel on the way, or sci-fi fantasy novel on the way. And he's been telling me about the piece that he's uploaded to us, which is great, a really kind of intriguing folklore piece about the Welsh marches, and it kind of describes them like you have never heard it before.
The chapel is at least 800 years old, but the shrine is over 1,000. The Lady Melangath protected the animals of the valley beneath her cloak there, her sanctity and purity keeping the hunting dogs away. An ancient Prince of Wales chasing a hare on his horse was so impressed by her that he forbade anyone to ever kill a hare in the valley again, and the valley kept its word from that day until this one.
When you put your writing sort of out there on social media, do people ever come to you with their kind of folklore stories, or say, have you heard about this? Did it get interactive?
Yeah, that reminds me, when I was doing film, I actually made a film about this valley as well that I grew up in, and I sort of put a call out there among people that I knew saying, could people tell me their stories of the valley? And it sort of led me down this rabbit hole of sort of this modern mythology, and everyone talked about it. So I went to interview farmers who lived there and have farmed there for decades, and they told me about everything from seeing ghosts on the marshes just above the valley to aliens landing in the valley and meteorites coming down and causing earthquakes. And this was all just within the last 30 years or so. So it's still going on now, which is also what I find fascinating, because that's modern mythology, isn't it? That's like stuff which might have another explanation, but actually it says more about the people living there, that they tell that particular story about that situation to each other, which I just find fascinating.
Memories of nights looking out across the plains of the Berwyns, those flat marshy grasslands at the head of Cymruath, the Ruath Valley. The plains extend out for untold miles, mist ever crawling across them. Since the earliest times, say the grasses and the ferns, they watched lonely travellers get lost on the Berwyns in that mist, which grew thicker the more lost the traveller became. Some memories tell of a great doorway made of light opening in the mist, offering a warm hall for the traveller to feast in, only to close up, its trap sprung, never to release them.
The man who now owns the house that I lived in that valley when I was growing up spoke about how he was remodelling the house, and then he took a wall down, and this is an old miner's cottage from hundreds of years ago. He took a wall down and found children's toys inside the wall, and he took them out and started having these nightmares of these children telling him to put them back and things, and so he put them back, and now the nightmares have stopped. But that made me think back to times when I was a kid, and actually I'm pretty sure the house was haunted. You know, and that's, again, looking back, I'm now thinking about that. But again, that's my own mythology that I'm creating about where I used to live. I've always written, I've always been a writer, but before that I was living in London. I used to work at the Science Museum. Then when I was in Brighton, I used to work for Lego. I literally got to like build Lego with kids and things, so that was quite fun. But then when the pandemic hit, that's when I went self-employed, because I could work from home and I could use some of the writing skills that I felt I'd developed in the meantime. But yeah, I've kind of done a bunch of things since university just to sort of, you know, pay the bills, but have also, as a writer, you're kind of always being fed by what's around you. So I got a lot from working in those other random jobs as well.
Sometimes as the sun was going down, I could hear something coughing, spluttering, grinding. The noise would come from the direction of the forbidden farm, and I'd whisper to the dragon across the valley to watch over my bedroom window while I slept, in case the farmer had managed to wake up his mechanical creature.
We live in this day and age of increasing AI technology. I mean, look at us now, you know, talking to each other using technology and putting this up on YouTube, but still, there's something magical about those stories of folklore and legend. People are still keeping those stories going, and it's just such a nice place to escape to, isn't it? The sort of magical places.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something I'm really interested in as well, and kind of what I wanted to talk about in the story was how, while we might have changed and the world might have changed and we're doing more modern things, the sort of world that was around when these myths were happening, that's still the world that we're physically living on. And so that's partly why I wanted to talk about things like the moon as being a living entity in the story, and all the grasses and the rocks in the valley as having memories of their own. Because I was thinking, well, if we're changing, maybe the Earth doesn't change so much, and it sort of holds on to these stories for us in some way. You know, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about as well.
I mean, so obviously you've studied this, sort of doing film, listening to the way you read the story. You've clearly got a great voice by the way you read it as well. So you're kind of well into that sort of that creative field. The book you're writing now, what's that going to be? What's that going to be about? Sort of more in depth.
It's going to be a trilogy, and it's more about me wanting to write something like the kind of book I would read when I was a teenager, when I was a kid. So, for example, Lord of the Rings, or, you know, even, you know, Narnia, or that kind of thing. But it's kind of, you know, it's a classic kind of hero's journey thing. It's sort of science fantasy, so it's in space, but it's not sort of technology and things. It's more magic, and actually a lot of the, you know, I wanted to base a lot of the sort of the cultures in the book on sort of ancient, you know, Welsh cultures, and try and use a bit of my own background, I guess, and knowledge of these things which haven't really been drawn on by a lot of other books and series. There's a lot of amazing magical creatures in Welsh mythology which just haven't really been used so much, and I just really wanted to sort of bring that out a bit more. But yeah, it's basically a sort of young adult sort of adventure story, and so if people like that, then they should check it out when it's done, whenever it's done.
Do you know what? After listening to that, I was just living some kind of fantasy novel in my brain then as well. I think that would be really good. I love a bit of folklore, some myths as well. I think it's really interesting when you look into, like, you know, what these stories were about, the traditions of places where you lived, and I've talked about it before many a time on this programme, but, you know, I love the whole spooky thing and all those kind of like stories about, you know, what happened in that old house, what happened in that, you know, in that piece of land, in that valley, all that sort of stuff. And that is Oliver Ferguson. If you want to find out more about him, he's writing this book. He's got other things that he wants to do as well. I suggest following him on on YouTube and having a look at his website, and you can keep up to date with what he's doing.